A quiet winter night in the mountains turns into a nightmare when a powerful millionaire thinks he can silence his pregnant wife as she sleeps, pressing a pillow over her face while the snow falls outside. But what he never realized is that someone was watching. And that someone is a trauma surgeon who recorded every second of the attack, and he is ready to burn the truth into daylight. What comes next is a story of survival, evidence, and justice, racing against time as life hangs in the balance. And trust me, you will not believe how far this case goes until we dive in. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The Montana mountains lay silent under a thick winter blanket as the clock approached 4 in the morning. Snow pressed against the wooden cabin like a white wall, and the wind moved softly through the vast pines surrounding the lonely property. A dim glow from the moon filtered through the frosted windows and settled across the hardwood floor in pale strips of silver. Every corner of the house felt frozen in place, as if time itself had been caught inside the cold darkness. Not a single sound disturbed the stillness, except the occasional whisper of wind slipping through the eaves. Inside the bedroom at the back of the house, Eleanor Hayes slept on her side with her breathing slow but uneasy. One hand rested over her belly in a protective curve, the natural instinct of a woman 33 weeks into her pregnancy. The fine lines across her face revealed days of exhaustion. Her husband's unpredictable temper had carved a constant tension into her body. Even asleep, her features carried a faint tightness, as though her subconscious remained alert for a threat that might reappear at any moment. Her long hair spread across the pillow, and her breaths released small puffs of warm air into the cold room. The heater in the corner hummed quietly, but it did little to soften the chill that clung to the walls. A fetal monitor sat on the nightstand with a soft indicator light blinking in a slow and steady rhythm. Samuel Hayes had installed it during a past health scare, wanting to make sure his sister's child was always under careful observation. Its glow cast a subtle reflection on the glass of a framed photograph beside it. The picture showed Eleanor smiling during a summer afternoon when life had still felt gentle and uncomplicated. In the current moment, that warm memory contrasted sharply with the icy silence enveloping the room. Without warning, the bedroom door eased open. A thin slice of hallway light spilled onto the wooden floor. The soft shift of brightness cut across the darkness like a quiet intrusion. Leonard Drake stepped inside and paused near the doorway as if measuring the space. The shadows deepened around him, giving his appearance an unsettling weight. At 45, he carried the stature of a man used to control, yet something in his rigid posture suggested unrest. His eyes lacked warmth or hesitation. He slowly closed the door behind him, sealing the room in a darkness that felt heavier than before. Leonard stood motionless for a long moment while his gaze fixed on Eleanor's sleeping form. The rise and fall of her breath seemed to provoke something inside him. His shoulders lifted slightly, then settled again with a cold steadiness. He moved toward the bed with measured steps. The floor creaked faintly under his weight. His presence filled the space with a pressure that felt unnatural. Once he reached the bedside, he looked down at her for several silent seconds. His expression remained flat and unreadable, as though he had already made a decision that no emotion could interrupt. Beside Eleanor lay a large pillow covered in a soft white case. Leonard reached for it calmly, and his hand sank into the thick material as he lifted it. There was no hesitation in his movement. With a quick and forceful motion, he pressed the pillow down over Eleanor's face. Her body reacted instantly. The quiet rhythm of sleep shattered into a desperate struggle as she kicked against the bed. Her hands clawed at the smothering fabric, trying to find an edge for air that refused to come. The room filled with muffled gasps and choked, frantic sounds that echoed off the walls with heartbreaking urgency. The baby inside her reacted as well, shifting violently in response to the mother's panic. The fetal monitor detected the sudden spike in stress and began to beep rapidly. The high-pitched alarm sliced through the room and shattered the fragile quiet. Numbers on the small screen jumped to dangerous levels. Eleanor's body thrashed in fear and confusion, while her energy drained rapidly. Her legs pushed against the blankets. Her chest heaved beneath the pillow, and her free hand trembled uncontrollably as she tried to resist the crushing pressure that suffocated her breath. The alarm's sharp sound startled Leonard. His hands froze on the pillow for a moment, as if the noise had interrupted a trance. He looked toward the monitor with wide eyes. The beeping grew faster, a relentless burst of medical urgency. His breathing shifted into short, uneven draws that betrayed his rising panic. After several seconds, he pulled the pillow away and stepped back from the bed. The abrupt release left Eleanor limp on the mattress. Her face had taken on a faint purplish tint. Her breaths came thin and broken, barely strong enough to rise above a whisper. Eleanor's body soon fell still, except for faint spasms that hinted at the shock running through her system. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, but she did not wake. The monitor continued its relentless cry as the baby struggled inside her. The pillow slipped from Leonard's hand and dropped onto the floor without a sound. His chest rose with a deep breath as he tried to steady his shaking hands. He stared at her with a blank expression that concealed more fear than he intended. His pulse pounded visibly at the side of his neck as he backed away from the bed. In the corner of the room, a small lamp glowed faintly. Inside the base of that lamp sat a tiny camera, nearly invisible against the frame. Samuel had placed it there weeks earlier after sensing something was wrong during a brief visit. The device captured every second of the attack. It recorded the shadows shifting across the wall, the violent movement of Eleanor's hands, and the moment Leonard released the pillow. The lens remained steady and unblinking as the footage streamed automatically to a secure digital backup system. A small indicator light began to flash rapidly as the motion reached a critical level. Miles away, Samuel slept in his own darkened bedroom. His cell phone rested on the nightstand with the screen facing upward. As the alert arrived, the device began to vibrate. A bright blue glow broke through the darkness and spread across the quiet room. Samuel stirred at the disturbance and reached for the phone. His thumb brushed across the screen. The alert message appeared with a severity that made his breath catch in his throat. His eyes sharpened as he saw the notice of high-risk movement detected in Eleanor's bedroom along with the live stream loading. The video began to display. The first image Samuel saw was the sight of Eleanor, lying motionless on the bed while the monitor beside her blasted a desperate warning. His grip tightened around the phone as fear rushed through him. The room around him felt suddenly colder. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The flashing alert continued to pulse on the screen while the terrible reality settled into his mind with overwhelming clarity. The stillness in his own home offered no comfort as he stared at the image that showed something had gone horribly wrong in the dark hours before dawn. The vibration of the phone cut through the darkness like a sudden crack of light. Samuel Hayes jolted awake, heart hammering before his mind even understood why. The room around him remained in deep shadow, lit only by the cold blue glow coming from the screen on his nightstand. He reached for the phone with an instinctive urgency. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the display. The alert filled the screen with a stark warning that made his breath stall. The camera feed from Eleanor's bedroom showed her lying motionless, while the fetal monitor beside her blinked in frantic flashes. The sound of the alarm transmitted through the speakers in sharp bursts that stabbed into the quiet of his house. Samuel's chest tightened. A wave of disbelief collided with a surge of fear that pushed him out of bed with a speed he did not know he possessed. He stood barefoot on the cold floor, staring at the video for a few more seconds, as if his mind needed confirmation that the terrible image was real. Eleanor's face was pale. Her chest moved weakly. The monitor numbers flashed dangerously high. The room behind her looked exactly as he remembered, except for the unmistakable sense of something gone horribly wrong. A tremor passed through his hands as he grabbed his jacket and shoved his arms into the sleeves. He called Eleanor's phone while racing toward the door, but the call rang without answer. The ringing cut through the air like a desperate plea that returned unanswered every time. He tried again, gripping the steering wheel of his car as he started the engine. The phone continued to ring in his ear until the call finally dropped. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to pull in a slow breath. His mind replayed the last seconds of the camera footage. Eleanor still breathed. The baby was still alive. There was no more time to lose. The snowstorm outside greeted him with a brutal gust that slapped against his face and numbed his cheeks. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the headlights to their brightest setting. The narrow mountain road ahead was coated in ice, and the dense snowfall reduced visibility to a faint blur. Samuel pressed the accelerator anyway. The car pushed forward, tires crunching through the frozen powder. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears, keeping time with the rhythmic sweep of the wipers as they struggled to clear the windshield. The darkness felt endless, and the isolation of the road added a suffocating weight to every mile he passed. The storm grew worse as he climbed higher into the mountains. Snow drifted across the asphalt in long sheets, and the wind battered the car with violent gusts. He leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowed in concentration. The beam from the headlights reached only a few yards, revealing tall pines bending under the weight of snow. Each turn of the road came faster than the last, forcing him to tighten his grip on the wheel until his knuckles turned white. Through it all, the image of Eleanor lying helpless stayed fixed in his thoughts, pushing him to move with greater urgency despite the dangerous conditions. When he finally reached the cabin, he slammed the car door shut behind him and ran toward the house. The porch lights were off. The silence felt heavier than the storm outside. His boots crunched over the snow piled against the steps. He pushed the front door open without knocking. It moved too easily, confirming his fear that Leonard had left it unlocked in a rush. The interior of the house was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the upstairs hallway. Samuel charged up the stairs 2 at a time, breath coming in sharp bursts. His hand brushed the railing while he steadied himself, and he reached the bedroom doorway with a harsh stop. Leonard stood near the bed, hands slightly raised as if trying to appear frantic. His voice carried a false strain as he spoke quickly. He claimed that Eleanor had stopped breathing and that he had no idea what had happened. Samuel did not respond. His eyes were already on his sister. He saw the bruise forming on her neck. He saw the faint red marks shaped like fabric pressed into her cheek. He saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The truth hit him immediately. There was no accident here, no panic attack, no nightmare. There was only violence. Samuel pushed past Leonard and went straight to the bed. He leaned over Eleanor, placing 2 fingers gently against her throat to feel for a pulse. It was weak but present. Her skin felt cold. Her breaths came in short, fragile movements that barely lifted her ribs. The fetal monitor at her side continued its alarming rhythm. Every number on the screen reflected rising danger. Samuel swallowed hard as he tried to steady his racing thoughts. He lifted her eyelid, watched the slow, delayed response, and knew they had only minutes before the situation became irreversible. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The call connected quickly, and he spoke with a strained voice that fought to remain steady. He described Eleanor's condition in clear medical terms. He emphasized the risk to her and to the baby. He told the operator that they needed an ambulance immediately. The operator confirmed that emergency services were being dispatched and instructed him to keep Eleanor still and monitored. Samuel thanked them without waiting for reassurance. He placed the phone beside the monitor and continued checking her breathing while murmuring soft words in an attempt to comfort her, even though she remained unresponsive. Leonard stayed a few feet away, trying to maintain his act of concern. Samuel refused to look at him. He focused entirely on Eleanor. The window panes rattled with the rising wind outside, and the sound added an intense urgency to the room. Samuel adjusted the pillow under her head and kept his hand near her pulse point. He directed his attention to the monitor, tracking the uneven heartbeat of the baby and the irregular spikes that signaled distress. His jaw tightened as each second passed. He wished he had reached her sooner, but wishing could not save her now. Only fast action could. The quiet between the alarms grew heavier. Samuel lifted his gaze when he noticed the faint reflection on the bedroom wall. Outside the window, streaks of red and blue light began sweeping across the snow. The distant sound of a siren carried through the wind, growing louder with every breath. Samuel rose from the floor and took one last look at Eleanor before heading toward the stairs. The emergency responders were seconds away. The lights outside intensified, filling the room with a mixture of color and hope. The moment the first flashing beam reached the bedroom window, the long night of terror shifted into the race to save her life. Red and blue lights flashed through the frosted bedroom windows as the ambulance screeched to a stop outside the cabin. The faint hum of the engine blended with the blizzard winds cutting across the mountain air. Within seconds, the front door swung open, and 2 paramedics rushed inside carrying medical bags and a collapsible stretcher. Their boots pounded against the wooden floor while their breath formed white clouds in the cold air. Samuel stood at the top of the stairs, waving frantically for them to hurry. He pointed toward the bedroom where Eleanor lay unconscious, barely hanging on to life. The paramedics reached the bedside and immediately assessed the situation. One knelt near Eleanor's head and checked her airway, while the other placed 2 fingers on her wrist in search of a pulse. They exchanged a tense glance. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak, her skin cold and slightly discolored from lack of oxygen. The fetal monitor continued to beep in rapid, unstable patterns that filled the room with a warning no one could ignore. One paramedic lifted Eleanor's chin to help open her airway, while the other prepared an oxygen mask. Samuel explained everything he had witnessed through the camera feed before arriving. As the paramedics leaned closer, they noticed the marks on her neck and the subtle imprints on her face. The injuries were unmistakable. They were not caused by a fall or a panic attack. They were signs of pressure and force. One paramedic glanced at Samuel and then at Leonard, who stood several feet away pretending to look distraught. Samuel stepped protectively toward the bed, blocking Leonard from getting any closer. The paramedics did not question him. They focused entirely on stabilizing Eleanor, while the fetal monitor alarm continued to spike erratically from the distress inside her womb. The team lifted Eleanor gently and slid the stretcher underneath her. The oxygen mask was placed over her mouth and nose, and a paramedic secured the strap around her head with steady hands. Samuel followed them closely as they maneuvered down the narrow stairs. The house shook slightly from the gusts of wind slamming against the walls. Snow blew across the porch as the door opened. The storm outside felt harsher than before. The cold air hit Eleanor's pale skin, but she did not react. Her body remained limp, carried only by the hands of those trying to save her. At the ambulance, the back doors were thrown open, and Eleanor was lifted into the bright interior lit by overhead medical lights. One paramedic climbed inside to monitor her breathing, while the other connected her to equipment designed to measure her oxygen levels and heart rate. Samuel climbed in as well, gripping the metal railing for balance. Leonard lingered near the porch, shouting questions that no one answered. The driver slammed the door shut, and the ambulance roared forward into the night. The siren echoed through the icy forest as they sped toward the nearest hospital in the Montana Valley. Inside the vehicle, the paramedics worked rapidly. One adjusted the oxygen flow while the other monitored the baby's heartbeat. The numbers fluctuated dangerously. Eleanor's eyelids twitched slightly, but she did not regain consciousness. Samuel sat beside her and held her hand tightly. The warmth he hoped to find was missing. Her fingers lay limp and unresponsive. He whispered her name several times, urging her to stay with him. The lights from passing snowplows and the glow of distant cabins blurred through the frosted windows with each bend in the road. Every mile grew heavier as the ambulance fought the storm. After nearly 20 minutes of tense silence and steady medical adjustments, the ambulance pulled into the small hospital located on the edge of a tiny Montana town. The paramedics lowered the stretcher and pushed Eleanor through the emergency entrance. Nurses rushed forward, guided by short commands from the paramedics. Samuel stayed close, refusing to leave her side. The medical staff quickly transferred Eleanor to a narrow hospital bed inside a small treatment room. The doctor on duty arrived moments later, wearing scrubs and a hurried expression. He examined her vitals, checked the fetal monitor, and studied the oxygen saturation numbers slipping lower than they should. The doctor's face tightened with concern. He asked Samuel what had happened, and Samuel responded with a short explanation centered on what he saw on the video. The doctor nodded grimly. He began a more thorough examination that revealed additional bruising on her shoulders that had not been visible earlier. The fetal monitor produced another series of high-pitched alerts. The doctor looked at the screen and stated that the baby's heart rate was dipping into a dangerous range. The hospital lacked the advanced maternity emergency equipment needed for cases like this. There was no neonatal intensive care unit, no specialized surgical team on call. A nurse stepped into the hallway where 2 police officers had arrived following the emergency call. She whispered something to them. They both turned to look at Leonard, who had just entered the building pretending to be breathless with concern. The officers instructed him to remain outside the treatment room. The nurse then returned inside and continued preparing equipment while the doctor addressed Samuel in a low, urgent voice. He explained that both Eleanor and her baby were at high risk. The hospital could not provide the care required. They needed to transfer her immediately to a major medical center equipped for obstetric trauma. Samuel nodded without hesitation. He would have agreed to anything that gave Eleanor a chance. The doctor picked up a radio and contacted the emergency flight transport team in Denver. He requested an airlift as soon as the storm allowed. The nurses began stabilizing Eleanor for transport by adjusting her oxygen line, adding another IV, and securing the monitor wires along her arm. Samuel stood at the side of the bed watching the flurry of movement. He fought to remain calm as he absorbed the weight of the situation. He kept reminding himself that she was still alive and that every second mattered now. Faint vibrations began to tremble through the walls as the sound of helicopter blades emerged from the distance. The emergency staff continued preparing Eleanor while communicating with the flight team outside. The hospital doors opened to a blast of wind and snow that swept through the hallway. A stretcher team hurried in to assist with the transfer, the room filled with cold air and spinning shadows from the helicopter lights outside. Samuel stepped back to give the team space as they positioned the stretcher and locked it into place. Eleanor's pale face reflected the bright lights from the open doorway. As the paramedics began to wheel her toward the exit, the roar of the helicopter grew louder. The freezing wind swirled around them, whipping through the open space as they pushed her through the doorway. The blinding light from the helicopter illuminated every falling snowflake and cast long shadows across the ground. Samuel followed the team as they rushed across the landing pad toward the aircraft. The blades spun in powerful circles overhead. The cold air vibrated with tension. The medical helicopter descended through the cold Denver sky with its blades cutting sharp circles into the night. Snow whipped across the rooftop of Denver Medical Center as floodlights illuminated the landing pad in harsh white beams. The aircraft touched down with a hard shudder as the wind pushed against its frame. Several doctors and nurses waited in thick jackets, bracing themselves against the gusts. Their eyes remained fixed on the helicopter door, ready for the emergency they had been warned about during the flight. Every second mattered, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. When the door slid open, a blast of frigid air rushed inside. Samuel stepped out behind the paramedics who guided the stretcher forward. His face looked drained from the long and terrifying flight. He had stayed beside Eleanor the entire time, watching each fragile rise and fall of her chest. He held her hand until the very moment the stretcher had to be unloaded. Now, under the bright rooftop lights, her skin appeared even paler than it had inside the helicopter. Samuel followed closely as the flight crew announced her vital signs to the waiting medical team. Inside the bright glare of the rooftop lamps, Samuel's eyes scanned the crowd of hospital staff until they landed on a familiar figure. His mother, Martha Hayes, stood near the entrance with both hands pressed over her mouth. She looked smaller than usual, wrapped in a thick winter coat with her gray hair blowing wildly in the wind. As soon as she recognized Samuel, she hurried toward him. Her face was streaked with tears. She clutched his arm with trembling fingers while searching for her daughter's face on the stretcher. Samuel steadied her gently and helped her move closer as the team rushed through the doorway. Martha let out a soft cry when she saw Eleanor more clearly. The oxygen mask covered most of her daughter's face, but the bruises around her neck and the cold tone of her skin revealed the truth that no mother could ever prepare for. She reached out as if to touch Eleanor's hand but stopped herself, afraid she might get in the way of the doctors. Samuel wrapped an arm around her and held her tightly as they followed the team down the corridor. Her sobs were quiet but heartbreaking, a sound that echoed faintly through the bright, sterile hallway. The hospital doors swung open wide as the emergency team moved fast, guiding the stretcher through a narrow passage lined with harsh white lights. Doctors in scrubs surrounded the bed, calling out instructions and exchanging quick assessments. One physician leaned over Eleanor's chest to listen to her breathing while another studied the monitor attached to her arm. The air smelled of disinfectant and cold winter air. The steady hum of machinery mixed with hurried footsteps as the group moved deeper into the emergency wing. Samuel watched every action with a clenched jaw, his mind focused on keeping himself steady. Just as they reached the intersection outside the surgical unit, a commotion stirred near the entrance. Leonard appeared in the hallway wearing an expensive coat and an expression molded into false concern. He attempted to approach the group with hurried steps, calling Eleanor's name as if he were a worried husband arriving too late. Before he could get close, 2 hospital security officers stepped into his path. They had been briefed by the police regarding the possible assault. They blocked Leonard firmly, preventing him from entering the restricted area. His face twisted with frustration as he demanded answers. The officers told him he would need to remain outside and wait for investigators. Samuel looked back long enough for his eyes to lock with Leonard's. There was no need for words. Everything that needed to be communicated passed silently between them. Leonard stopped speaking when he saw the cold resolve in Samuel's stare. Martha squeezed Samuel's arm tightly, grounding herself against the fear that kept rising in her chest. The medical team continued moving Eleanor forward, leaving Leonard behind in the hallway as the doors swung closed. Inside the emergency prep room, the lights were brighter, and the urgency intensified. A senior obstetrician gave quick instructions to the nurses preparing the sterile table. Monitors were connected. IV lines were checked. Oxygen support was increased. Another doctor examined Eleanor's airway with practiced hands and nodded grimly, confirming the suspected damage from the assault. He turned to Samuel and asked him to step closer. Samuel approached, standing beside the bed while Martha hovered just behind him. The lead doctor explained that Eleanor needed immediate intervention to protect both her and the baby, who was still in distress. Samuel listened with steady eyes, even though his heart felt as though it were tightening inside his chest. The doctor placed a clipboard in his hands and asked him to provide consent for emergency procedures if needed. Martha watched her son with a mixture of fear and gratitude as he took the pen. His signature flowed with a calm firmness that masked the turmoil within him. Once the paperwork was signed, Samuel leaned down and placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. He whispered a few quiet words and felt the faint warmth of her skin. Martha reached out and touched her daughter's shoulder gently before stepping back. The doctors quickly moved into position. Several nurses secured Eleanor's stretcher and checked the monitors again. A nurse pulled the curtain open and signaled for the surgical team to prepare the operating room. Samuel stood near the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides as he fought against the helplessness pressing into him. Martha stood next to him, clutching her rosary and whispering a prayer beneath her breath. Both of them watched as the stretcher began to move again. The wheels rolled smoothly across the white floor tiles as the team guided Eleanor toward the double doors of the operating suite. The hallway seemed longer than it actually was. Each step echoed loudly against the polished floor, mixing with the rhythmic beeps of the machines connected to Eleanor. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on the group, revealing the worry etched into every face. When they reached the surgical doors, the team paused just long enough for the lead doctor to give one last instruction. Then the doors swung inward, releasing a burst of cold, filtered air from inside the operating room. The smell of antiseptic filled the space around them. Samuel and Martha remained on the other side of the threshold as the doctors pushed Eleanor inside. The glass panel in the door showed a blur of movement, but no meaningful details. The moment the stretcher disappeared behind the curtain, a nurse pulled the door closed. A sudden hush fell over the hallway. The bright light from the operating room spilled through the thin strip at the bottom of the door, creating a sharp contrast with the dimmer corridor. Samuel stood completely still, his breathing deep and heavy. Above the door, a red indicator light flicked on with a crisp glow. It signaled the beginning of the emergency intervention. The hallway felt colder, as the light cast a soft reflection across the polished floor. Martha held her son's arm with a trembling grip. They stood together in silence, watching the luminous red glow as the life of someone they loved hovered in the balance. The bright white lights of the emergency unit cast a sharp glow across the room as the doctors worked over Eleanor with unwavering focus. The air smelled of antiseptic, cold metal, and urgency. A surgical nurse adjusted the monitor cables, while another lifted the blanket that covered Eleanor's torso. The obstetrician leaned in closer, examining her skin with trained precision. He traced the outline of a bruise on her shoulder. Another bruise ran across her upper back. Purple marks lined the side of her neck, and a faint rectangular imprint remained on her cheek. These details painted a picture the medical team recognized immediately. None of these injuries could have come from a fall or an accident. They spoke of violence. The obstetrician exchanged a grim look with the trauma doctor assisting him. An ultrasound wand glided over Eleanor's abdomen while the machine captured images of the struggling baby within. The heartbeat flickered in chaotic patterns on the screen. A nurse made quiet notes about the injuries, recording each bruise and mark. When she reached Eleanor's neck, she paused for a moment. The pressure pattern was too defined, too localized. She lifted her gaze to the doctor and silently confirmed what they were all thinking. Every detail pointed to an assault. On a nearby counter, a nurse opened the small brown envelope that Samuel had handed over when he entered the unit. It contained documents taken from the pocket of Leonard's coat. She pulled out a neatly folded sheet and unfolded it. Her eyebrows rose as she read the contents. It was a life insurance policy. The coverage was substantial, shockingly high for a couple of their age. She flipped to the second page and found the date signed. It had been purchased only 1 month earlier. Leonard was listed as the sole beneficiary. The nurse showed the document to the attending physician, who exhaled slowly and shook his head. The doctor placed the paperwork on the counter and signaled for the charge nurse. He instructed her to report the findings to hospital administration. Because of the suspicious nature of the injuries and the recently purchased insurance, the hospital was required to contact federal authorities. The charge nurse nodded and stepped out of the room with determined strides. Meanwhile, another nurse documented Eleanor's old injuries from previous visits. Several months earlier, she had been treated for a minor fall that never quite made sense to the staff. Tonight, everything aligned into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Within 20 minutes, 2 federal agents arrived at the emergency department. Their coats were dusted with snow, and their breath hung in the cold air as they entered the brightly lit room. They introduced themselves, then asked Samuel for details. Samuel stood near the foot of the bed, his shoulders squared despite the exhaustion etched into his features. He explained that he had captured video footage through a hidden camera placed in Eleanor's room. He pulled out his phone and brought up the cloud recording. The agents watched intently, their expressions tightening with every second that passed. One agent asked to plug the phone into a hospital laptop for verification. The digital forensics program ran quickly. No metadata irregularities appeared, no signs of edits, no traces of manipulation. The footage was authentic. The agents exchanged a brief, firm nod. The obstetrician continued his examination while the agents reviewed timestamps and the sequence of events. They asked Samuel several follow-up questions. His answers remained steady, though his voice carried the weight of fear that had been building inside him since the early hours of the morning. Just as one of the agents began asking about Leonard's behavior earlier that night, an alarm pierced the room. The fetal heartbeat on the monitor dropped suddenly. The lines on the screen trembled and dipped. The room fell into an instant hush. Every sound seemed to disappear, except the urgent beeping that filled the air. The obstetrician moved with immediate purpose. He ordered everyone except essential staff to stay back. The trauma doctor repositioned Eleanor's oxygen mask while the obstetrician checked her abdomen again. A nurse updated the readings aloud with a voice clipped by tension. Samuel froze where he stood. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. The sharp rhythm of the alarm reminded him of the moment he saw the attack unfold on his phone. His breath grew shallow, but he forced himself not to move closer. He knew he could not interfere. A nurse placed a gentle hand on his arm and spoke softly, telling him that the team was doing everything possible. Her reassurance helped only slightly, but Samuel nodded and stayed where he was. His eyes never left the monitor. The next minute felt like an hour. The doctors exchanged short commands as they worked to stabilize Eleanor's oxygen levels. Another nurse adjusted the IV, increasing the flow. A second monitor displayed the baby's movement, which had slowed almost to nothing. The room pulsed with a mix of panic and determination. The fetal heartbeat dipped again, then hesitated. The obstetrician pressed his fingers along Eleanor's abdomen with care, searching for the best angle. The ultrasound image flickered faintly on the screen, showing the tiny form fighting to hold on. Finally, after several tense seconds, the heartbeat rose slightly. Then, it rose again. The monitor softened its frantic beeping as the line on the screen climbed back into a safer range. A collective breath released from the staff. The trauma doctor updated the numbers with relief in his voice. The obstetrician stepped back several inches, exhaling quietly as the immediate danger began to ease. He looked at Samuel and gave a small, reassuring nod, though the weight of the situation remained heavy in his eyes. The 2 federal agents waited respectfully, while the doctors confirmed the stabilization. When the room steadied again, they approached the counter and resumed reviewing the evidence. One agent spoke to Samuel in a calm tone, explaining that the video he had provided could become one of the most important pieces in the investigation. The authenticity and clarity of the footage were undeniable. Combined with the medical findings and the suspicious insurance documents, a clear picture began to form. A nurse handed the agents a copy of the written medical report so they could include it in their preliminary file. Another nurse checked the monitor again and wrote down the new readings. The fetal heartbeat remained stable. The room gradually regained its rhythm as machines hummed at normal pace. The bright overhead lights illuminated Eleanor's still form, making her look fragile but safe for the moment. Samuel stepped closer and stood beside her bed. He looked at the monitor and watched the new steady pattern forming on the screen. His eyes burned, but he held himself together with a mix of strength and determination. He placed a gentle hand near Eleanor's arm, careful not to disturb any of the equipment. A soft glow spread across the monitors as the numbers settled into a stable range. The staff moved quietly around the room, continuing their work while giving Samuel a moment of stillness. The steady rhythm from the machine created a fragile sense of hope that seemed to wrap around the room like a warm blanket. Nothing else mattered in that instant except the calm heartbeat glowing on the screen, proof that the fight was not over. It marked the final moment of the crisis inside the room, bringing Part 5 to its quiet close as the team prepared for what would come next. Leonard walked out of the Denver police substation with a stiff expression and a forced calmness that did not match the tension still lingering in the air. The officers had finished their initial questioning and released him pending further investigation. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of his expensive coat as he stepped into the cold morning light. Reporters nearby attempted to approach him, but he kept his gaze straight ahead and made no comment. Though he had not been arrested, the weight of suspicion followed him like a shadow. He knew he needed to take control of the narrative before it spiraled out of reach. Within 2 hours, he met with a public relations team in a private conference room at a high-rise overlooking downtown Denver. The city lights reflected off the snow that blanketed the streets. Leonard sat at the head of the table while several PR strategists spread documents and talking points across the polished surface. They discussed messaging, tone, and timing. Leonard nodded with impatience, urging them to move faster. He wanted the first statement released before noon. He believed that if he acted quickly, public opinion could still be steered in his favor before the hospital or the FBI shared their findings. By midday, a carefully worded press release circulated through local news outlets. It stated that Eleanor Hayes had been experiencing severe emotional stress related to her advanced pregnancy. It claimed she had a history of anxiety and that she had collapsed after a panic episode. The statement painted Leonard as a concerned husband who had been cooperating fully with the authorities. It hinted that Samuel Hayes had interfered in the past and implied that his involvement stemmed from jealousy and resentment rather than genuine concern for his sister. Several morning shows repeated the release almost word for word. Meanwhile, online posts began to appear on social media. Anonymous accounts shared stories suggesting that Eleanor had been unstable for months. They described her as overwhelmed, fragile, and prone to dramatic reactions. Some posts accused Samuel of exaggerating events to make himself appear heroic. Others suggested he had a long-standing dislike for Leonard because he resented Leonard's financial success. None of the posts were sourced, but their tone was calculated. They sowed doubt. They questioned character. They planted seeds that Leonard hoped would root deeply before the truth reached the public. Leonard watched the spread of online commentary from his penthouse suite. He paced the living room with a restless stride as his PR team updated him on trending topics and reactions. Although a few early comments supported him, the majority remained neutral. He could feel control slipping in ways he had not anticipated. He pressed his hands against the cold glass of the window and stared down at the busy street far below. He tried to reassure himself that money, influence, and strategy would be enough to turn the tide. Yet beneath that confidence lay a hint of fear that he refused to acknowledge. The shift began when the FBI issued its preliminary response. A spokesperson confirmed that the video Samuel had turned in did not show any signs of editing. The metadata was intact. The cloud backup matched the original timestamp. Experts found no irregularities. At the same time, technicians examined the pillow collected from the bedroom. They recovered fibers and fingerprints consistent with Leonard's contact. They also found a partial DNA sample near the corner seam. The combination of evidence left little room for alternative explanations. The announcement spread quickly through news feeds. Television anchors reported the developments with measured seriousness. The online comments changed rapidly. Readers began questioning Leonard's earlier claims. Some deleted their previous remarks. Others demanded answers. The tone shifted from uncertainty to anger, as more people wondered why a man with significant wealth had purchased a large life insurance policy for his pregnant wife only 1 month earlier. The policy was now under federal review. Investigators confirmed that the beneficiary listed was Leonard alone. This fact caught the attention of several investigative journalists who immediately began digging deeper. The hospital added to the growing pressure by releasing its own statement. It confirmed that Eleanor Hayes had arrived with clear signs of oxygen deprivation and external force trauma. The attending obstetrician had found no evidence of self-harm or accidental injury. The hospital stated that the situation had been reported to law enforcement due to the severity of the findings. This official confirmation spread quickly and became the focus of headlines across Denver by early evening. The words struck a nerve with the public. Sympathy grew for the unconscious woman fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. The PR team tried to counter the momentum by releasing an updated statement about Leonard's cooperation with authorities. However, the public no longer responded as they had earlier. The comment sections under major news posts filled with skepticism. Questions about the insurance policy, the injuries, and the video evidence circulated with increasing intensity. Community leaders posted calls for justice. Advocacy groups for survivors of domestic violence began sharing Eleanor's story. The tide no longer belonged to Leonard. It belonged to the people who believed the truth spoke louder than any curated message. Outside Denver Medical Center, the crowd of reporters grew larger. News vans lined the sidewalk. Camera crews positioned themselves near the entrance, waiting for updates on Eleanor's condition or a statement from the FBI. The air shimmered with anticipation as flashbulbs popped every few seconds. Inside the hospital, Samuel moved through the lobby, escorted by a nurse who made sure he was not overwhelmed by the press. His shoulders were heavy with exhaustion. His eyes reflected nights without sleep, yet his steps remained steady. He refused to appear shaken in front of the cameras. As he passed through the front doors of the hospital, the sound of clicking shutters filled the air. Journalists shouted questions about the investigation, but Samuel did not stop. The bright flashes illuminated his tired features while he focused on reaching the elevator that would take him back to Eleanor's room. The crowd outside continued calling his name, but he walked forward with quiet determination. Behind those doors, Eleanor lay in the recovery room, unaware of the storm that raged beyond the walls of the hospital. The final flashes lit the glass panels of the lobby like tiny bursts of lightning. In that moment, the chaotic energy of the media frenzy paused for a heartbeat before the doors closed behind Samuel. The glow from the cameras faded as the hallway dimmed again. Inside the quiet room on the upper floor, Eleanor remained motionless, her breathing supported by machines. The steady rhythm of the monitor beside her continued to rise and fall, marking the fragile boundary between what had happened and what was still to come. Soft morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds of the recovery room as the steady hum of hospital machines created a gentle rhythm in the background. The air felt cool and sterile. A faint scent of antiseptic lingered. Eleanor Hayes lay motionless beneath a thin, white blanket. Her breathing came in slow, measured waves that rose and fell with fragile steadiness. She drifted between unconsciousness and faint awareness, her mind wrapped in fog. Then, with a hesitant flutter, her eyelids trembled. A thin sliver of brightness broke through the darkness inside her mind. She felt the world return to her in pieces, like scattered fragments slowly floating back into place. Her eyes opened fully after several attempts. The overhead lights cast a soft glow across her vision, making the room appear distant and dreamlike. A faint pressure settled on her chest while her throat burned with the memory of lost breath. For a moment, she could not recall where she was or how she had arrived here. Her gaze drifted across the unfamiliar ceiling, then down to the tubing connected to her arm. The soft beep of a monitor measured her heart rate with calm precision. Confusion crept into her expression as she struggled to grasp what had happened before everything went dark. A familiar shape sat beside her. Samuel leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. His eyes looked exhausted, ringed with shadows from nights without sleep. His jaw was tense, and his breath trembled as he waited for any sign that his sister would awaken. When Eleanor shifted slightly, he lifted his head. For a moment he froze, unsure if he had imagined it. Then her eyes flickered again. Something inside him broke free. He stood quickly, his voice cracking with emotion as he leaned closer to her bedside and whispered her name. Across the room, Martha Hayes stood with her hands squeezed together near her chest. Her shoulders shook with silent anticipation. For hours she had remained by the window, praying in quiet desperation. When she heard Samuel's choked whisper, she turned sharply toward the bed. Relief flooded her features as she saw Eleanor's eyes finally open. Martha reached the bedside in a few steps and placed a trembling hand on the blanket near her daughter's arm. Tears slid down her cheeks as she let out a shaky breath. The sight of her daughter alive brought a wave of gratitude that nearly buckled her knees. Eleanor struggled to form words. Her throat felt tight, as if something heavy still lingered there. Samuel lowered his voice and told her she was safe. He reminded her that she was in Denver Medical Center and that the doctors had been fighting for her and the baby. A tear slipped from the corner of Eleanor's eye as she absorbed his voice. She could see the strain in his expression, the fear he had been carrying alone. She felt Martha's fingers brush gently against her wrist and turned her head slightly to meet her mother's tearful gaze. The fragile reunion filled the room with an overwhelming tenderness. The soft moment shifted when two police officers stepped quietly into the room. They moved with care, respecting the vulnerability of the scene before them. One of the officers spoke in a calm, steady tone as he explained that they needed to ask Eleanor a few simple questions. They made clear that she could stop at any time. Eleanor swallowed with difficulty but nodded slowly. She understood the importance of what they needed. She drew in a shallow breath and tried to steady herself. The officers waited patiently until she signaled she was ready to begin. Her voice came out thin and hoarse. She described waking in the dark and feeling an intense weight pressing down on her. She struggled to breathe. She fought to lift her hands but could not gain strength. She remembered the sensation of panic rising inside her chest, the baby twisting sharply in her belly, and the alarm of the monitor erupting with piercing urgency. Her words came in broken fragments, but each piece built a clearer picture. When she spoke the name of the person who had pressed the pillow against her face, Martha covered her mouth in shock and heartbreak. Samuel's grip tightened on the side rail of the bed. His eyes filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow as Eleanor continued to describe the terrifying seconds before she lost consciousness. Her breaths grew heavier as she recalled the sound of the monitor beeping wildly. She remembered seeing a shadow above her and feeling the world narrow into a single hopeless point where oxygen refused to come. Martha broke down into quiet sobs, while Samuel leaned closer, encouraging Eleanor to speak only as much as she could handle. The officers maintained their calm, writing down each detail without pressure. Once Eleanor finished recounting her memory, the officers presented a set of documents. They explained that these papers authorized her official statement and granted permission for the medical team to release her full records. They also included consent to use the video evidence provided by Samuel. Eleanor stared at the documents for several long seconds. Her hand trembled when Samuel placed the pen between her fingers. He assured her she did not have to face this alone. She took one unsteady breath, then another, gathering the strength that had nearly been stolen from her. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name with slow determination. The room grew still after the last stroke of her signature. Martha leaned down and hugged her daughter gently, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. She whispered shaky apologies for not seeing the warning signs sooner. Eleanor whispered back that she had hidden everything out of fear and shame. Samuel placed a steady hand on Eleanor's shoulder and reminded her that none of this was her fault. His voice carried a quiet promise that he would protect her and the child with everything he had. The closeness between them filled the space with weight and warmth. The officers gathered the documents carefully and placed them into a thick folder. One officer thanked Eleanor for her courage. The other assured her that her statement would be treated with the gravity it deserved. They stepped back, preparing to leave the room. As they crossed the threshold, the camera angle from the hallway framed the moment through the narrowing gap of the door. The officers closed the folder firmly, sealing the first official record of her testimony. The soft light from the recovery room spilled onto the floor, illuminating the hallway as the door eased shut. The morning settled quietly over the Denver suburbs as a pale layer of sunlight pushed through the thinning storm clouds. Leonard Drake stepped out of his car and walked toward the entrance of his modern stone house. The driveway was still covered with patches of frozen snow, and the air smelled crisp and sharp. He moved briskly, his breath visible in the frigid air. He believed that after a few days out of sight, he could regain control of the public story. He repeated arguments in his mind as he reached for the door handle. He strengthened his expression and prepared to rehearse the version of events he wanted the world to hear. Inside the house, the silence wrapped around him like a heavy coat. He tossed his keys onto the counter and loosened the collar of his jacket. He turned on a few lights, trying to breathe more easily. He imagined the statements his PR team would push. He imagined sympathetic interviews and rehearsed lines that painted him as the victim. He looked at himself in the hallway mirror, straightened his posture, and took a long breath. He thought he still had a chance to control everything. That fragile confidence lasted only 10 seconds. A sudden explosion of red and blue light flooded through the living room windows. The flashing colors rolled across the walls and ceiling. Leonard spun around, confused. The rising hum of multiple engines filled the air. Tires skidded to a stop outside. Doors slammed. Men shouted commands. Leonard froze for a moment as the unmistakable sound of law enforcement filled the quiet neighborhood. He rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds. Several police cruisers and 2 black SUVs marked with federal plates lined the street. Officers were spreading across his front lawn with urgent purpose. A loud voice boomed through a speaker, amplified and impossible to ignore. They ordered Leonard to step out of the house with his hands visible. They repeated the command with a sharper edge. Leonard stumbled backward, his heartbeat surging in his throat, fear mixed with anger. He backed away from the window, knocking a picture frame from the table. The glass cracked against the floor. He shouted that they had no right to be there. He yelled that everything was a misunderstanding. His voice cracked as the commands continued outside. Panic clawed at his ribs. Leonard locked the door and hurried into the kitchen. His hands shook as he grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the counter and hurled it across the room. It shattered loudly against the tile. He picked up a long shard of glass and held it tightly. The jagged edge glinted in the morning light. He breathed in short, furious bursts. He screamed toward the front door that he was being framed and that he would not let anyone in. For a moment he stood still, listening to the heavy boots gathering outside and the muffled voices preparing to breach the entrance. The front door splintered inward as officers forced it open with practiced precision. Leonard yelled angrily and rushed toward them with the broken shard raised in his hand. The officers reacted instantly. One blocked his swing with a shield as another tackled him from the side. Leonard hit the ground with a hard thud as the glass skittered across the floor. His head struck the tile, sending a sharp pain through his skull. He struggled violently, kicking and thrashing against the weight of several officers. They moved with controlled force, pinning his arms until they secured the cuffs around his wrists. Outside the house, a small crowd had already gathered. Some neighbors stood bundled in coats, holding their phones high as they captured the dramatic arrest. One of them whispered that the footage would spread across the internet within minutes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The flashing lights lit up the snowy neighborhood as officers lifted Leonard to his feet and marched him outside. His coat dragged across the steps. His face twisted in rage as he shouted curses toward anyone within earshot. The cold wind whipped around him while the cameras continued recording every moment. Leonard was pushed into the back seat of a waiting SUV. The door slammed shut behind him. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned forward, furious and trembling. His wrists throbbed against the metal cuffs. An officer climbed into the front seat and radioed that the suspect was in custody and ready for transport. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving behind flashing lights and a growing number of curious onlookers. Leonard pressed his forehead against the cold window, muttering angrily to himself as the houses passed by in a blur. At the FBI field office in Denver, the SUV rolled through a secured gate. Leonard was escorted out of the vehicle, and into the building under bright fluorescent lights. Agents guided him down a long hallway where his steps echoed sharply. His mugshot was taken. His fingerprints were scanned. He was instructed to sit in a metal chair inside an interview room with white walls and a camera fixed in the corner. He tried to appear confident, but his legs shook beneath the table. An agent entered with a stack of documents and set them neatly in front of him. The agent began the questioning calmly. He spoke with a controlled tone that contrasted sharply with Leonard's rising agitation. He presented photographs of Eleanor's injuries. He displayed the report from the hospital documenting oxygen deprivation, external force trauma, and fetal distress. He placed the life insurance contract beside the other documents. Then he pressed play on the video Samuel had captured. The room filled with the faint but unmistakable sound of Eleanor gasping beneath the pillow. The agent watched Leonard's face as the footage continued. Leonard grew pale. He tried to speak, but the agent raised a hand. Leonard insisted the video was fake. He insisted Eleanor had been unstable. He insisted Samuel had manipulated everything. Each claim was met with evidence that contradicted him. The agent presented the metadata verification, the fingerprint results, and the DNA match from the pillow. With every page turned, Leonard's voice weakened. Sweat collected on his forehead. His hands tugged at the cuffs in restless frustration. Then the agent delivered the final blow. He informed Leonard that Eleanor had regained consciousness. She had already given her full statement. She had named him. Leonard's mouth fell open. His face drained of color. He slumped back in the chair with a hollow stare. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the story he had tried to control was no longer his to shape. The agent gathered the documents and stood. Leonard was escorted down another hallway toward the holding cells. The metallic clang of doors echoed sharply as he passed through each secured section. The corridor smelled of cold, concrete, and disinfectant. A guard opened a heavy door and gestured for Leonard to step inside. The small cell was dimly lit, with a narrow bed fixed to the wall. Leonard hesitated as if expecting someone to stop the process. When no one did, he stepped forward. The guard closed the door behind him. The lock clicked with a cold, definitive sound. The echo lingered through the hall, settling over the quiet wing of the detention area. The light from the hallway faded through the small window in the cell door as the room grew silent once more. Cold morning air swept across the steps of the Denver Federal Courthouse as crowds gathered long before the doors opened. Reporters positioned thick cables along the walkway, while photographers checked their lenses against the pale winter Sunday. A long line of citizens waited behind metal barriers, many of them older residents of the city who had followed the case with heavy hearts. Their breath rose in white clouds as they murmured quietly about the trial that was now described as one of the most disturbing domestic violence cases in recent memory. The tension settled over the plaza like a weighted blanket. Inside the courthouse, security officers guided people through metal detectors. The polished floors reflected the bright overhead lights. Every footstep sounded louder than normal. An officer announced that the courtroom was nearly full. The trial would be public and would allow broad attendance because of overwhelming interest from the community. Those who managed to find seats carried a solemn stillness. Some whispered prayers. Others folded their hands in silent anticipation. The sense of urgency was unmistakable. Everyone felt the gravity of what would unfold in the next few hours. A ripple moved through the crowd when two federal marshals appeared in the doorway, escorting Leonard Drake. He wore a bright orange prison jumpsuit and walked with heavy, reluctant steps. His wrists were secured in cold metal cuffs. The harsh overhead lights cast stark shadows across his pale face. He avoided looking at the crowd, but he could not escape the flashes popping from every direction as reporters captured his arrival. He flinched at the bursts of light, blinking rapidly as he scowled toward the photographers. The marshals urged him forward until he was seated beside his attorney at the defense table. Minutes later, another wave of movement passed through the courtroom. Eleanor Hayes entered through a side door in a wheelchair, guided by a nurse and followed closely by Samuel and Martha. Eleanor's face looked fragile but determined. Her hands rested on a light blanket covering her legs. She took slow breaths, steadying herself against the emotions rising within her. The courtroom softened when she appeared. People rose from their seats in quiet respect. Some older women placed their hands over their hearts. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment as recognition passed through the room. Samuel and Martha stayed on either side of Eleanor as she was positioned near the front. Samuel's hand hovered protectively near her shoulder. Martha dabbed her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed by the memory of nights spent fearing her daughter would never wake. When Eleanor glanced back at them, both gave her small, reassuring nods. She faced forward again, her posture straightening with courage that surprised even herself. The sound of the judge's approaching footsteps broke the stillness. The judge entered and took his seat with measured composure. He surveyed the room before signaling for the proceedings to begin. The prosecutor stood and addressed the court with a clear, steady voice. He introduced the case and outlined the charges, then directed attention to the large screen positioned at the front of the room. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered to life. The video captured by Samuel's hidden camera began to play. A nervous hush spread across the room as the violent scene unfolded before the audience. The footage showed Leonard entering the bedroom, lifting the pillow, and pressing it down over his wife's face. The muffled sounds of Eleanor's panicked attempts to breathe echoed through the speakers. The steady beep of the fetal monitor grew louder and more frantic. Several people in the audience covered their mouths. Others lowered their heads. The video ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence behind. No one dared speak. Even Leonard's lawyer remained still, aware of the devastating impact of what had just been shown. The prosecutor introduced the first witness. A senior FBI agent stepped forward and described the digital analysis performed on the footage. He explained how the metadata had been examined by experts and how the timestamps aligned perfectly with the cloud backup. No signs of tampering had been found. He presented lab results verifying the fingerprints and DNA collected from the pillow. Each fact delivered landed like a stone. Leonard's eyes darted anxiously from the agent to the judge, then back again. The tightness in his jaw betrayed his rising panic. When Samuel took the stand, the room shifted again. His presence carried a quiet gravity. He recounted the night he awoke to the alert, the frantic drive through the snow, and the moment he found Eleanor near death. His voice trembled only once when he described seeing her lying still with the monitor screaming in the darkness. Many in the gallery wiped tears from their cheeks. Samuel steadied himself and continued. His testimony painted a vivid portrait of the terror he felt as he fought to bring his sister to safety. The prosecutor called the obstetrician next. The doctor spoke clinically but with sober clarity. He detailed the symptoms of oxygen deprivation and explained how the lack of airflow had endangered both mother and child. He described the injuries on Eleanor's neck and face, identifying them as the result of external pressure. He explained that if the medical response had been delayed by even a few minutes, the outcome could have been fatal. Several jurors shifted in their seats, visibly moved by the severity of the doctor's words. Leonard grew restless. His hands twitched against the cuffs, and his shoulders tensed with agitation. At last, he stood abruptly and shouted that the video was fake. He claimed that Eleanor had suffered from emotional instability and accused Samuel of hating him. His voice cracked with frustration. The judge struck his gavel firmly, demanding order. The sound reverberated through the courtroom. Leonard's attorney urged him to sit and be silent, but Leonard muttered angrily under his breath as the prosecutor resumed. After hours of testimony, the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The room fell into a tense quiet as the jurors filed out, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment and took a careful breath. Samuel leaned toward her and whispered softly, reminding her she was safe. Martha placed a gentle hand over Eleanor's blanket, offering silent support. Reporters whispered into microphones. The judge reviewed documents while everyone waited for the return of the jury. When the jurors finally re-entered the chamber, every head lifted. Their expressions were serious, and several looked shaken by the weight of their decision. They moved into position with slow, deliberate steps. The foreperson held a folded paper in both hands. He took a deep breath before speaking. His voice carried through the courtroom as he announced that they had reached a unanimous verdict. A ripple of tension swept across the room. Even the air seemed to grow still as the judge prepared to speak. The judge lifted the polished wooden gavel with deliberate care. For a brief moment the room held its breath. The sound of cameras clicking faded. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The final seconds stretched thin, suspended in heavy silence, as the judge readied himself to deliver the ruling that everyone had been waiting for. The courtroom held a stillness so deep that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade. All eyes remained fixed on the judge as he lifted the wooden gavel with steady hands. The jurors had returned only moments earlier and delivered their unanimous decision. Now the ruling rested on the voice of the court. A soft breath moved through the room. The judge looked directly at Leonard Drake, who sat rigid in his seat with his wrists bound, and his expression clouded with fear and defiance. The judge spoke slowly as he read the final sentence announced by the court. Leonard Drake was found guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. He was found guilty of assault causing endangerment to a pregnant woman. He was found guilty of attempted insurance fraud with intent to profit from the harm of his spouse. Each charge carried heavy weight. The judge continued by stating that the severity of the crime, combined with overwhelming evidence and the extreme danger faced by both mother and child, left the court with no option other than the strictest punishment. The judge declared a sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for the first 30 years. The gavel struck the block with a sharp, resounding crack. The sound echoed across the tall walls and settled into the silence that followed. Leonard jerked as if the blow had fallen upon him directly. His mouth fell open with disbelief. He shook his head violently and shouted objections that tangled together without meaning. His hands trembled as he tugged against the cuffs. He yelled that he was innocent. He yelled that the system was corrupt. He yelled that the verdict was wrong. None of it mattered now. The marshals stepped toward him with calm authority and instructed him to stand. The room reacted slowly. A woman in the audience covered her face with both hands and cried softly. Others nodded quietly in agreement with the ruling. Several older citizens in the gallery leaned toward each other and whispered that justice had finally been delivered. The entire atmosphere shifted from tension to solemn relief. As the marshals led Leonard away from the defense table, the cameras flashed repeatedly, capturing his contorted expression. He twisted his shoulders as if trying to break free, but the officers did not loosen their grip. They directed him firmly toward the exit. Eleanor Hayes sat silently in her wheelchair, her hands clasped over the blanket draped across her legs. A single tear fell from the corner of her eye and glistened in the courtroom light. She did not cry from fear. She cried from release. The weight that had pressed on her for months slowly began to lift. She inhaled carefully, feeling her body loosen as a sense of safety finally returned. Samuel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Martha leaned close with trembling lips, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. For the first time since that terrible night in Montana, Eleanor felt a flicker of genuine peace. Outside the courthouse, the winter air felt less harsh than usual. Reporters spoke rapidly into microphones as the marshals escorted Leonard through the crowd and toward the waiting vehicle. The sound of clicking cameras filled the air. Leonard lowered his head, no longer shouting, no longer fighting, consumed instead by a stunned silence. The back door of the transport van opened. He was guided inside. The door shut with a heavy metallic thud. The van pulled away from the curb as spectators watched the final moment of his departure. 6 months passed. Spring melted into early summer. The harsh winds of winter softened into warm breezes that drifted across the valleys of Montana. In a bright hospital room with wide windows and golden sunlight, Eleanor Hayes held her newborn daughter in her arms. The little girl's skin glowed softly beneath a pale blanket. Her tiny fingers curled gently around Eleanor's thumb. The nurses called her a strong baby. Samuel and Martha stood nearby, watching the scene with tears glistening in their eyes. They had survived the unthinkable and arrived here, in a moment filled with hope. Eleanor named the baby Grace. She chose the name to honor the quiet strength that had carried her through every moment of danger. She felt that Grace represented the life saved against all odds. When the infant let out her first strong cry, the sound filled the room with a sense of promise. Samuel reached out and touched the baby's hand with soft reverence. Martha leaned down and kissed her granddaughter's forehead. Love filled the room like warm sunlight. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor gained strength. She walked slowly at first, then with growing confidence. She spent long afternoons rocking Grace to sleep while listening to the birds outside her window. Samuel worked tirelessly to establish the Grace Foundation, a nonprofit program dedicated to supporting pregnant women facing abuse. Donations came from across the country. Many came from older citizens who had watched the trial closely and felt deeply moved by Eleanor's courage. Churches, senior centers, and community groups rallied around the mission. Eleanor soon began sharing her story at gatherings hosted by these organizations. She stood before crowds filled with people of all ages, though many were seniors who felt a profound connection to her resilience. She spoke gently. She spoke honestly. She described her fear and her survival. She told them that no one should endure hardship in silence. Her voice carried across rooms with a steady strength that inspired those who listened. After each event, people lined up to hug her, thank her, and share their own stories of struggle. She held their hands and reminded them that healing was possible. As the months continued, Eleanor returned to her family home in Montana. The mountains rose proudly in the distance. The trees swayed with quiet rhythm. One warm evening, she stepped onto the porch with Grace asleep against her shoulder. The sky shifted into a gentle shade of gold as the sun lowered across the ridgeline. Samuel stood beside her with a calm smile. Martha sat on the porch swing and watched her children with pride. The moment felt slow and perfect. A hush of peace settled around them as the breeze moved softly around the house. Eleanor looked down at Grace. The baby stirred and opened her eyes, gazing upward with innocent curiosity. Eleanor whispered a soft promise that their life would be different now. Grace tightened her tiny fingers around her mother's hand. The warmth of that small gesture traveled through Eleanor's entire body. She leaned her cheek against her daughter's forehead and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle deep inside her. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the porch. Samuel stepped closer. Martha smiled with quiet joy. In the stillness of that evening, surrounded by family and the gentle breath of the mountains, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt safe. She felt whole. She felt the beginning of a new life, rising like the warm glow of the horizon before her.